The RCMP Heritage Centre is a not-for-profit charitable organisation mandated to share the story of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. This is one of those stories, part of your heritage.
Well, I grew up in Newcastle, New Brunswick, very small, socially depressed area of northern New Brunswick, economically depressed. But went to Catholic school, very strict Catholic family. And one day, walking to St. Mary's, I was 7 years old, and 3 members of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police came out of Newcastle Courthouse. I knew at that moment exactly what I was going to do with my life. I never questioned, I never thought of anything else other than to become a member of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. I always kept myself in shape. I worked hard at school. I made excellent marks. I went to St. Francis Xavier University for a short while, but the moment that I could apply to become a member of the force, that's exactly what I did. Shortly after turning 19 years of age, I received the call to go over to Fredericton to get sworn in. And I remember that morning my mom and dad came with me, and Inspector Kerr was the staffing officer. And I took the various oaths of office and allegiance and secrecy. And I can remember my mother walking up to the inspector and grabbing his hand, and she said, "Sir, I hope you realize you're getting a very fine cut of the family cloth." That afternoon, I was on the plane to Regina and arrived here. And as I say, kept myself in good physical shape. So the whole physical aspect of training never bothered me. My father was a very strict boss, and he ran a milk manufacturing plant, a co-op. And the men there were you know, they were, I guess, rough would be the easiest thing to explain. And I'll give you an example. I was 16 years old, and my father was one of the very first dairies in Canada that came out with the cardboard cartons going away from glass bottles of milk. But in any event, at one point in time, they thought they were going to run out of cartons. So I wouldn't be 17, and my father asked me to take a 5-ton truck to Montreal, load it up with cartons, and bring it back, because the train a CN train load of these cartons had gone missing. So they were worried that the cartons would be, there'd be a shortage to package milk in these cartons. Off I went, first time out of New Brunswick, 5-ton truck, down Highway 20, into Montreal. And coming into Montreal, I stopped at gas. And I remember asking a gentleman who couldn't believe this young boy with this big truck was heading to Montreal. And he asked me if I liked the Montreal Canadiens. And I said, yes, I love the Montreal Canadiens. And he actually went in and was able to get me hockey tickets to go to see the Montreal Canadiens. Up I went on the Metropolitan Boulevard. I've never seen traffic like this in my life. And here I am with a 5-ton truck. And I was supposed to go northbound onto Carey Street, and I ended up going southbound onto Carey Street. And I said, oh my God, like, how am I ever going to? And I remember there was an accident just down below as I was going down. Somebody ran into one of these brand new cement telephone poles. I've never heard of a cement telephone pole before that came crashing down on the highway. Anyways, next morning I made it to the plant that manufactured these cartons, loaded up the truck as much as it could handle, and headed back to New Brunswick. And I arrived back, and the train had arrived. So it was all for naught. But I remember a gentleman coming out that worked for my dad and just giving it to me. Why did we send you all the way to Montreal for that amount? You should have put on twice the load that you have on that truck. So that being roared at, you're not doing good enough, you could do better. The corporals were a joke to me at Regina. Like they were nothing compared to what I had survived in New Brunswick. So that was it. But the other thing in New Brunswick, you know, you go up, it's a rough area. So you looked after yourself. And I remember there was a couple of gentlemen in teaching us self-defense. One was a Corporal Franklin, another one was a Corporal Steve May, and there's a third gentleman I forget. But anyways, he came over and I was going to be the demonstration student of what it was. And I just kind of lost it. And he was the guy that ended up on the floor instead of myself. But I remember they would do these quarterly assessments on you. And there was another incident with another corporal. We were playing floor hockey in the new gym at Depot, and he was playing rough, so I played rough back. And he didn't like it. And but I mean, there was tension, and everybody, oh my God, what is he doing? But in any event, I remember being in and being counseled that you're doing very well in Regina, but we're concerned that you're not showing respect to the corporals, and you're being confrontational at times with them, you know. So I remember that, and so I took that as wise advice and just took what came to me after that. But I developed a love for running while I was at Depot, and this morning I was up. I ran 10 kilometers at 5 o'clock this morning. I'm 58 years of age. I ran from the Hotel Saskatchewan out around Wascana Park and back. So it's something that has stayed with me all my life. The other thing I think I really learned there was I was in a co-ed troop. We were supposed to be the first official co-ed troop at Regina, and I'm glad that I had that experience, because throughout my career I always had concerns about how women were being treated in the force. But having that experience at Regina, having been part of a co-ed troop, I think I was always sensitive and always alert to the fact that there's a line that you do not cross, and always respecting your fellow colleagues. So that was another, I think, very valuable lesson that I learned in Regina. My first posting was Peterborough, Ontario. I was 19 years of age. I was in Peterborough, Ontario, and I went to Peterborough Drug Section. And I remember I was just so ill-equipped. One of the first cases that we were working on was a Dutch fellow that was importing drugs from Holland, Amsterdam, and going downtown Toronto, doing surveillance, never having done surveillance in my life, and being asked to get out of the car and be a footman. What's that? And my colleagues being all frustrated. Well, don't they teach you that at Regina? No, because so O Division, Federal Division was certainly a different thing. Peterborough, we had a lot of cases like that. I did a lot of work against the Hells Angels, the Vickers gang. Learned to do wiretap, and really learned to develop informants. And that would pay tremendous dividends later on in my homicide career in the RCMP. From there, I went down to Toronto, Ontario, Toronto Drug Section, and did a lot of undercover work in Hamilton against organized crime families, Dominic Musitano in particular. They were intimidating truck drivers to join a certain union so that they could control the independent trucking operations in southern Ontario. From there, I went to the Northwest Territories, something that I always wanted to do, 3 years service. But I was smart. I went back home to Newcastle, and I married my hometown sweetheart, Anne. And dear Anne graduated from university 1 week. We were married the following week. The third week, she found herself in Fort Ray, Northwest Territories, 1,800 Dog Rib Indians and 8 white people. Throughout the summer, she had these bouts of, she just couldn't believe. The culture shock was just overwhelming for her. But anyways, that fall, she got a teaching job at the Ray Edzo School in Fort Ray. And before long, she was as happy as could be in Fort Ray. Fort Ray was a particularly violent community. They had tremendous problems with alcohol, drugs, and the sanitary issues at the detachment in the residences were just repulsive. I remember we had a water truck and a sewer truck, and the water truck would deliver your water, and the sewer truck would take your refuge from your sewer tank out. Well, one day the pump broke on the water truck. So what would the Aboriginals do? They'd get the pump off the sewer truck, put it on the water truck. And these types of incidences were long. So we'd be having medical pills the size of golf balls to deal with gastrointestinal issues every now and then. It was so bad in Fort Rae that when I was there, 4 members quit the RCMP. They didn't get transferred out or whatever. They had enough, and this was it. But Ann and I, we I don't know what it was. We just fell in love with the Aboriginal people. I had just a wonderful time. And I remember on top of the fridge, she'd have a paycheck from school. I'd have a paycheck from the force, but we'd have groceries. And I remember every once in a while, Ann would pull the fridge out to clean behind the fridge, and we'd find all these paychecks. Like we never even bothered cashing these paychecks, and they'd fall off the back of the thing. But anyways, with regards to the members quitting, there was one particular summer, I think it may have been my 3rd summer in, that I was left there all alone at the detachment. And it was violent. It was unbelievable. Like I would go out on a given night and maybe have 20 people inside the detachment cells, intoxicated people. And you look back, on commissioners' commendations and all these awards that remember, like I took knives off of people, I took guns off of people. It just never stopped. And you'd be doing sexual assault investigations all by yourself. You'd be going to a suicide all by yourself. And it was just constant. But anyway, and you'd never sleep. You'd just get into bed and the phone would ring. But I remember one night, or one morning waking up and Ann saying, "Kevin, last night you came home, you were crying." I said, "No." She said, "You were. You were getting into bed and you were crying." And it was just non-stop, violent, going to scenes of crime that were, just on by myself. And I remember it got so bad that I would go to a residence and I'd open up the back doors of the Suburban and I'd back the Suburban up to the back of the residence. And I'd go in there and I'd arrest everybody. I don't care who they were. I'd put everybody in the police truck, take them back to the detachment and lodge them in cells, because I knew if I left anybody there, within another half hour, 45 minutes, I'd be called to another complaint. I mean, it was totally reprehensible what I did, but I mean, it was survival. That was the only way you could survive. I delivered children in the back of the police truck. There's a young man up there somewhere. His name's Kevin Chocolate, named after me for having been born in the back of the police truck. But man, oh man, did I learn. Like I learned budgets, I learned admin, I learned classification. I didn't have to go to Harvard Business School after Fort Rae. I had it all down, and I had a section NCO that was as tough as nails. His name was Dave Dorr, and he didn't care. There was no excuse. Everything had to be perfect, and that was a great learning opportunity as well. I left Fort Rae after we spent actually 4 years there. It was a 1-year posting for single people, 2-year posting for married people. But because of the members quitting there, we ended up staying 4. And incidentally, Ann cried the day we left. She was sorry that she was leaving the place. But and the other thing I think I'll before I move on, we had tremendous issues with in those days called juvenile delinquency, break and enters, damage done to the power commission's vehicles, their storage garages, and this type and the other thing. I remember one time I just got it into me out on the detachment, Marion Lake, which froze early and stayed on. I went in to see NCP, the Northern Power Commission, and said, "Look, continually your vehicles are getting damaged, whatever. Would you put telephone poles in with streetlights in the ice by the detachment?" And they agreed to that. And then I wrote out to the armed forces. And to make a long story short, I ended up equipping 400 Aboriginal children with hockey equipment. And for the rest of the winter, we essentially had no juvenile delinquency crime. I'd go home at 4 o'clock in the morning, and the kids would still be out there on the lake, underneath these street lights on the glass. Then into Yellowknife. And Yellowknife, I went to GIS. I was an investigator, and did an awful lot of sudden death and homicide investigations. In the 3 years I was in Yellowknife, I did 33 sudden death investigations. And after a while, I began to build a bit of a reputation on getting confessions from suspects of crime. And I remember, I think it was about the 8th, that other members would want to watch me doing a interrogation of a suspect. And I remember this particular case, and if I could just back up maybe just for a second, my dad always taught me about the importance of values. And one of his values that he instilled into me as a young boy was always respect the dignity of people. So each time I went in to interview a suspect of a homicide, I always said to myself, thinking of my father, regardless how repulsive the crime, you always respect the dignity of the person. And I remember this one particular case, I think we were about three and a half hours into the interview, and I got speaking with the young man about his youth. And he broke down and started crying. And he basically essentially told me about being sexually assaulted as a young boy. We got that off the table, and forthcoming then was the confession for the homicide. I remember walking out the door, and there was 7 or 8 of our guys there, with a whole bunch of explicit. Hey, Vickers, you got, blah, 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 And I said, guys, for the grace of God, go we, what he experienced in his youth obviously made him a dysfunctional person. And the other thing I often did with my homicide people after getting a confession, I always stayed in contact with them. I'd always go see them at pretrial detention. I always took them coffee, whatever books they wanted to read. And that paid dividends. I remember one particular case where this young fellow had shot another guy just outside of Yellowknife. And his stepfather was a wealthy businessman from Hamilton, Ontario. And he hired a very reputable defense lawyer out of Winnipeg by the name of Hirsch Walsh, who I think is still practicing law, but he was a formidable defense lawyer and very intimidating. And I remember during the voir dire to get the confession into court, he was really giving it to me. You would have done anything to trick my client. You would have done anything to say this to my client. And the accused name was Michael. And I remember him in front of the judge looking up at Hirsch Walsh and saying, "You leave Kevin alone." That was probably, but again, going back to the principles of respecting the dignity of people. And obviously, and after that case, the Crown and defense made a deal right after that utterance, and he pled guilty to manslaughter. And that was the end of that trial. After Yellowknife, and Yellowknife, only the North will give you opportunities. I was with Prince Andrew, who was up on a canoe trip the day my son Andrew was born. And when he was leaving town, Prince Andrew, and years after, would communicate with us wanting to know how his namesake was doing. So, I guess we all have those opportunities. The force gives us to meet people of interest. Then I went down as my first detachment, Fort Resolution, and they used to call it Fort Revolution, and it was another Fort Ray. I mean, this is a place nobody would want to go. Violent, just serious crime, and I think there was probably one of the only times in my career that I thought I was gonna die. There's a little guy by the name of Gary Yelly. He was only a small Aboriginal guy, but he was a violent person, and he was often drinking and what we call sniffing gasoline. And it would be just like grabbing onto a big German Shepherd. Like this guy was, but again, it was one of these nights. One of my constables, Bob Kemp, was off on vacation. And Glenn McDonald was the other member who was homesick. He was violently sick with a flu. So anyways, I was working this one night, and Gary was out doing it. So anyways, I went down, arrested Gary. It was a break and enter that he had committed, and it was a sexual assault that he had committed, and put him in the back of the police truck and brought him to the detachment. I was by myself, and I don't know why I did this. I have no idea why I did this, but I went into the detachment, I took my service revolver off, and I put it in the safe, the detachment safe, and locked it up, because Gary's a handful when you're dealing with him. And anyways, I brought him in, and he was, like passive aggressive, but nothing serious, and put him in cells. That was easy. Well, just 10 minutes later, those plasticized mattresses, he was tearing those things, putting them in the toilet and flushing the toilet, and the water was coming out of the cell toilet. And like a fool, I went in the cell too, and the fight was on. And the fight was in the cells, in the cell block, out to the detachment, and all of a sudden I'm starting, and he's getting the best of me. And, I remember being so scared that, is this going to be it, with this guy, In Fort Rae, we had just got new phones, which were modern phones. They were the dial push-button phones. And I reached up, and I remember having him kind of pinned down and finally clicking a button that Glenn McDonald, who's home sick, got the phone call, and me winded and totally exhausted, saying help. And within minutes, Glenn came, and that's one of the times in my career I thought, this is going to be it with this fellow. Out of Fort Rae, or Fort Resolution, off to Calgary we went. Calgary, Alberta, Calgary Drug Section. And this is the first time I got some culture of the force going to another division. And this was not viewed very nicely by the members of K Division, that some guy from some outside division would get Calgary, Alberta. And I remember the resentment that I faced, and the disgruntlement of other members, that who's looking after you, to be able to get such a wonderful posting in Calgary. And it was just a wonderful time. The kids were young. 1988 were the Olympics. We used to go down every night to see the medal presentations. It was just an incredible time to be a family, to be in Calgary, Alberta. It was just an incredible thing. But this is when my O Division experience really started to pay off, especially in the two things which I had some expertise in: developing sources and Part 6 Privacy Act investigations. And it wasn't long before I was into some very, very good files. One file that I hadn't self-generated but supervised the Calgary end was, there was a group of gentlemen from El Paso named the Dudleys, who met up with a group of Irishmen from Notre Dame de Grâce, Montreal, known as the West End Gang. And they met in Calgary, and they actually hired our source to help them build an airstrip. And the Dudleys had a fleet of aircraft, and they were going to fly cocaine, marijuana directly from Mexico into Delbanita, Alberta, and transport it to the Vancouver, Montreal, Toronto markets. And this source that I got to work with on a daily basis was the most obnoxious man that you could ever imagine. He weighed about 300 pounds. Personal hygiene was incredible, and he was terribly difficult to handle. But there's a young fellow that I worked with, Bob Akins, on Calgary Drug Section. But anyway, for the next 2 years, we signed up, the force signed up for $75,000. And then when the DEA heard that we had an in to the Dudley organization in El Paso, they signed up for $125,000 American. This is back in 1991, so $200,000 for this agent to work with us. And so in any event, I spent an awful lot of time flying back and forth down in El Paso, Texas. And I remember we had to sign a state secret form for a recording device that you can buy at Shoppers Drug Mart now for $9 probably, or $8. And basically, it was a digital tape recorder that are commonplace now. But in 1991, that was top secret stuff. And he simply carried this. He's with him each day, and I would meet him at night in a hotel after him spending the day with the suspects. I remember he always wanted a pizza, and would be doing up notes for court, and he would take his fingers and he'd have his mouth down by the table, and he'd be pushing the tops of the of the pizza. And this is what you live with in El Paso, Texas for time and time on end, chasing these bad guys. Make a long story short, we did very well. At one point in time, they built an airstrip. It took them an entire summer, and we were down at Christina Lake, down the Kootenays of southern British Columbia. A little girl got lost, and search and rescue flooded the air with aircraft trying to find this little girl, and they found this airstrip in the middle of nowhere. And they started using the airstrip to base their operations. So the bad guys thought, we're done, we can't use this strip anymore. So they decided to actually truck a huge amount of marijuana in one night through the back roads from Washington into British Columbia. And we arrested them in Spokane, and that was the end of it. The interesting thing, the main U.S. fellow was a guy by the name of Don Dudley, and his warrants would still be out for his arrest. And the next day in court in Spokane, he was released on bail to report to El Paso. Well, this was unheard of, like, especially in the States. And the DEA guys went ballistic with the judge. They could not believe the judge would release this guy. And sure enough, he flew from Spokane to Chicago, gone, disappeared, never seen or heard tell of since. And I remember Dale Newkirk, who's the El Paso police officer, he called me about a year and a half later, and he says, Kevin, those Catholics in action. I said, who? He said, those Catholics in action, with that Texan thing. I said, what are you talking about? The CIA. Dudley was working for the CIA, you know. And so they just walked in and scooped him up, and they, you know, and apparently the best we could figure out is that he was getting his drugs from organized cartels in Mexico within the army, within the Mexican army. And so he himself was probably the same as our source, but just working at a little higher level. But it was a great case.